All right, welcome back. We are on part 5, Where did the Book of Mormon come from? I'm glad you joined me again so that we can look at this question. Now, in our timeline, we of course want to bring it up again, and I know that you're probably getting tired of seeing this timeline, but it helps us to mark some things. So we know in 1816, Spalding died. We know in 1830, the Book of Mormon was published. And then we saw that there's that 14-year gap, and I promise we will get to that gap. And you'll see much more clearly how it is the case that manuscript found turned into the Book of Mormon. And then we saw that missionary activity takes place, and in 1833, Hulbert was converted but turned into apostate. And closely afterwards, he gathered witness statements, of which we looked at the 8 of them in our last 2 videos. We then saw that before moving on, let's concern ourselves with the witness statements. YouTube channel Saints Unscripted, we saw that they were wrong about stating that the originator of Spalding theory was Hulbert. We looked at even 1 year, even 2 years before Hulbert, and saw that there was connections between Sidney Rigdon and there was connections between Spalding and the Book of Mormon. So he says this, according to these, so Saints Unscripted says, according to these affidavits, these people remember Solomon Spalding reading part of a manuscript to them that contains names and details later found in the Book of Mormon. But as a summary of them, let's hear what the anti-Latter-day Saint author Fawn Brody said about them. So this is what Fawn Brody says, and no man knows my history. It can clearly be seen that the affidavits were written by Hulbert, since the style is the same throughout. It may be noted also that although 5 out of the 8 had heard Spalding's story only once, now friend, that detail is just clearly wrong. There was a surprising uniformity in the details they remembered after 22 years. 6 recalled the names Nephi, Lamanite. 6 held that the manuscript described the Indians as descendants of the lost 10 tribes. 4 mentioned that the great wars caused the erection of the Indian mounds, and 4 noted the ancient scriptural style. The very tightness with which Hulbert here was implementing his theory arouses an immediate suspicion they did a little judicious prompting. Now, you'll see that I look at the affidavit statements themselves, and we're going to record and show you, the audience, the details of what they say. Just to let you know, that's coming up in the next few videos. So, like I say, reread these affidavits for yourself and see the details. So, we're still on our adventure with D.P. Hulbert. So Hulbert had reported the witness statements from the Conneaut area and went back to Painesville, Ohio. And a committee had been formed that would finance and help Hulbert's trips as he tried to uncover the truth of the origins of the Book of Mormon. John Spalding had talked about after Spalding's death in 1816, Spalding's widow, Matilda, had gone to live with her half-brother, William Sabine, in New York. So Hulbert, what does he do? Well, he proposed to the committee finance the trip to Palmyra, New York, where Joseph Smith lived, and also visit the Spalding widow. So on October 1833, Hulbert sets out on his long trip. He visits Conneaut, Ohio, again, as we saw in our last video, and he was able to get some statements. The purpose was to gather letters from the witnesses, Lake, Wright, and others, to permit him to have a copy of the Spalding manuscript from the widow so that it could be compared to the Book of Mormon. So we see his travel here. So after Conneaut, Ohio, and getting the letters, Hulbert made the long trip to Palmyra, New York. That's where Joseph Smith lived, just in case some people did not know that. So in early November 1833, Hulbert arrived in Palmyra. And then between November 3rd through 15th and November 28th through December 13th, he collected many affidavits testifying of the poor, questionable character of Joseph Smith and his activities, which you will find located in Mormonism Unveiled, which is written by Eber D. Howe in 1834. Between November 15th and November 28th, Hulbert went to visit the Spalding's widow, who lived in Onondaga County, New York. So you can see that there on the map. Then, what does Hulbert do? So Hulbert learns that she no longer lives there. He arrived at her half brother's house and learned she had remarried a Mr. John Davidson of Hartwick, New York, in 1819. The marriage lasted only 11 years, and Mrs. Matilda Davidson now had moved east to Monson, Massachusetts, to live with her daughter, Mrs. Matilda McKinstry, and the half brother Sabine also added a letter to give to her after Hobart gave his purpose. Hobart kept traveling on. So here he is traveling, and he finally makes it to Monson, Massachusetts. So we know that Hobart arrives there, and we know that he arrived around November 22nd, 1833. Matilda McKinstry's testimony, which was the daughter, she says, I believe it was in 1834, but actually it was 1833, that a man named Hobart came to my house at Monson to see my mother, who told us that he had been sent by committee to procure the manuscript found, written by the Reverend Solomon Spaulding, so as to compare it with the Mormon Bible. He presented a letter to my mother from my uncle William Sabine of Onondaga Valley, in which he requested her to loan this manuscript to Hobart, as he, my uncle, was desirous to uproot, as he expressed it, this Mormon fraud. Hobart represented that he had been a convert to Mormonism, but had given it up, and through the manuscript found wished to expose its wickedness. My mother was careful to have me with her in all the conversations she had with Hobart, who spent a day at my house. She did not like his appearance and mistrusted his motives, but having great respect for her brother's wishes and opinions, she reluctantly consented to his requests. The old trunk containing the desired manuscript found she had placed in the care of Mr. Jerome Clark of Hartwick's when she came to Monson intending to send for it. So, and this is continuing, on the repeated promise of Hobart to return the manuscript to us, she gave him a letter to Mr. Clark to open the trunk and deliver it to him. And that's found in Ellen Dixon's book, her paper called Scribner's Monthly. Spaulding's widow had placed the writings of Solomon Spaulding in a trunk left at her niece, Mrs. Jerome Clark, in Hartwood, New York. She finally gave permission with letters to let Hobart open the trunk to see what laid inside. Whoo! So what laid inside? Well, let's find out. So, D.P. Hobart, of course, he's getting the permission to look into the trunk. He opens the trunk up in anticipation. And what does he discover? One manuscript entitled Manuscript Story, Conduit Creek. Now, he discovers other writings that Spaulding had written, but supposedly reported no manuscript found. Now, there is controversy, though, on whether or not Hobart did find manuscript found, to be discussed later, but only gave Manuscript Story, Conduit Creek, to E.D. Howe in Painesville, Ohio. So, before Hobart returning to Ohio, he visits Pomeroy Tucker, editor to the Palmyra Wayne Centennial in Palmyra, New York, and this is what was written. The Mormon mystery developed. Dr. Hobart of Kirtland, Ohio, has been engaged for some time in different parts of this state, but chiefly in this neighborhood, on behalf of his fellow townsmen, in the pursuit of facts and information concerning the origin and design of the Book of Mormon, which, to the surprise of all in this region who know the character of the leaders in the bungling imposition, seems already to have gained multitudes of believers in various parts of the country. Requests us to say that he has succeeded in accomplishing the object of his mission, and that an authentic history of the whole affair will shortly be given to the public. The original manuscript of the book was written some 30 years since by a respectable clergyman now deceased, whose name we are not permitted to give. It was designed to be published as a romance, but the author died soon after it was written, and hence the plan failed. The pretended religious character of the work has been superadded by some more modern hand, believed to be the notorious Rigdon. Interesting, right? These particulars that have been derived by Dr. Hobart from the widow of the author of the original manuscript. So Hobart, he heads back to Palmyra, New York, from where he got the writings in the trunk, And he actually collects some more affidavits concerning Joseph Smith. So he heads back from Hartwick and makes his way back to Palmyra. Then he makes his way back to Ohio. You see that it's pretty long ways away. And then December 20th, 1833, Hulbert talks about what he discovered to the committee. Hulbert holds more public lectures. He shoots himself in the foot when he spouts off that he wants to kill Joseph Smith. True meaning, of course, being the system of the Mormon faith. So, according to the affidavit of J.C. Dowen, he says, I heard Dr. Hulbert. Now, he wasn't a doctor, that's just his name he was given. He had been a Mormon preacher, preach a good sermon, and then deliver his first lecture in the Methodist Church in Kirtland, Ohio, on the origins of the Book of Mormon. He said he had been in New York and Pennsylvania and obtained a copy of Spalding's manuscript found. He read selections from it, then the same from the Book of Mormon. He said the historical part of it was the same as Spalding's manuscript found. He read numerous affidavits from parties in New York and Pennsylvania showing the disreputable character of the Mormon Smith family. Hulbert stayed at my house every 3 or 4 days for as many months. I read all of his manuscript, including Spalding's. Now, he says, including Spalding's manuscript found. Compared it with the Book of Mormon, the historical part of which is the same as Spalding's manuscript found, which is about the size of the papyrus Joe had with his Egyptian mummies. Hulbert said he would kill Joe Smith. He meant he would kill Mormonism. The Mormons urged me to issue a writ against him. I did as recorded in my docket, December 27, 1833, on complaint of Joseph Smith, warrant returnable to William Holbrook, Esquire, at Painesville, Ohio. He was brought to trial, and over 50 or maybe 15 witnesses were called. Trial lasted several days, and he was bound over to appear at the Court of Common Pleas at Chardon. Hulbert let E.D. Howe of Painesville have his manuscript to publish. I should not be surprised if Howe sold Spalding's manuscript found to the Mormons. There was all kinds of iniquity practice at that time. Now, here's what I want to show. We talked about controversy, whether Hulbert had found manuscript found in the trunk or not. And, it might have, of course, been a mistake on the part of Mr. Dowen here, who, says in that second paragraph there, I read all of his manuscript, including Spalding's manuscript found, and maybe he was just thinking about that it was actually referring to manuscript story, but we unfortunately just don't know. It's hard to tell, right? So there is controversy over this. Well, Hulbert says after being in the Painesville, Ohio area, he made his way to Conneaut with manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, about December 30th, 1833, a few days after Dowen's writ. Hulbert went to speak to the witnesses on whether manuscript story, Conneaut Creek, was the manuscript Spalding wrote. In part 4, we covered an unsigned letter of Wright, but it's worth repeating again to be placed now in the proper context. So remember how Farkas, he had gone to the New York Public Library and he found a 1914 bulletin, and he found that there were two things. One was the contract between Henry Lake and Solomon Spalding, and the second one was an unsigned letter that we now know to be from the handwriting of Aaron Wright. So we found that to be interesting. And an unsigned letter dated December 31st, 1833, Conneaut, relating the recognition by the writer of the identity between entries of the Book of Mormon and the Solomon Spalding manuscript. So, like we said about this unsigned letter belonging to Aaron Wright, it was a draft personally dictated by Wright to Hulbert. The time frame, Hulbert returned to Wright to obtain another personal witness testimony on December 31st, 1833. And obviously, he was at the place where Wright had worked. So here's an excerpt from the letter, which we did not read last time, so let's read it very carefully here. Dear Sir, whereas I have been informed that you have been appointed with others to investigate the subject of Mormonism, and a resolution has been passed to ascertain the real origin of the said book, this is therefore to inform you that I have made a statement to D.P. Hulbert, relative to writings of Solomon Spalding, Esquire. Hulbert is now at my store. I have examined the writings which he had obtained from Spalding's widow. I recognize them to the handwriting of Spalding, but not the manuscript I had reference to in my statement before alluded to. As he informed me, he wrote in the first place, he wrote for his own amusement, and then altered his plan and commenced writing a history of the first settlement of America. The particulars you will find in my testimony dated September 1833 or August 1833. So Hulbert also obtained affidavits, but they did not survive, probably burnt in a fire at the newspaper office. That manuscript story was not the same story from Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. And the evidence for that is that when the first manuscript was discovered in 1884 in Honolulu, it had a statement written on the back that said the writings of Solomon Spalding, proved by Aaron Wright, Oliver Smith, John Miller, and others. The testimonies of the above gentlemen are now in my possession. D.P. Hulbert. And as you can see, we are showing the handwriting statement again. And I believe you can actually see it pretty clearly, right? I think it's pretty simple to read, actually, this. And December 29th through the 30th, 1833. So Wright and others tell Hubbard that Spalding informed him that the unfinished Roman story, or what we call manuscript story, Conduit Creek, the one manuscript discovered in the trunk, had been written by him for his own amusement. He switched gears and began writing a different story, giving a fictional history of the first settlement of America. He went farther back with dates and writing in the old scriptural style in order to appear ancient. After obtaining the new affidavits from Conduit, we know that Hulbert returns to the Kirtland area, and the work of Hulbert would be published in E.D. Howe's book, Mormonism Unveiled, in 1834. Here's a picture of that book. So, going back to our timeline. So, 1816, Spalding dies. 1830, the Book of Mormon is published. Missionary activity takes place. 1833, and D.P. Hulbert was converted, but afterwards became an apostate. He gathered witness statements. We know of 8 persons: Spalding, John Spalding, Martha Spalding, Oliver Smith, Nahum Howard, Aaron Wright, Henry Lake, John Miller, and Artemus Cunningham. And those statements were placed in Howe's book, Mormonism Unveiled, 1834. So you do see the chain of custody there. Witness statements do get passed on, and they're preserved in that book. And there were other witness statements gathered later by others. So we're going to look at a couple of those now. So we're going to now look at 1839. We're going to look at what Spalding's widow, Matilda Davidson, said about this matter. She wrote it in the Boston Recorder, April 19th, 1839. So let's listen to what she has to say. As this book has excited much attention and has been put by a certain new sect in the place of the sacred scriptures, I deem it a duty which I owe to the public to state what I know touching its origin. That its claims to a divine origin are wholly unfounded needs no proof to a mind unperverted by the grossest delusions. That any sane person should rank it higher than any other merely human composition is a matter of the greatest astonishment. It is received as divine by some who dwell in enlightened New England, and even by those who have sustained the character of devoted Christians. Learning recently that Mormonism has found its way into a church in Massachusetts and has impregnated some of its members with its gross delusions, so that excommunication has become necessary, I am determined to delay no longer doing what I can to strip the mass from this monster of sin and to lay open this pit of abominations. Reverend Solomon Spalding, to whom I was united in marriage in early life, was a graduate of Dartmouth College, was distinguished for a lively imagination and a great fondness for history. At the time of our marriage, he resided in Cherry Valley, New York. From this place we were moved to New Salem, Ashtabula County, Ohio, sometimes called Conduit, as it is situated upon Conduit Creek, Shortly after our removal to this place, his health sunk, and he was laid aside from active labors. In the town of New Salem, there are numerous mounds and forts, supposed by many to be the dilapidated dwellings and fortifications of a race now extinct. These ancient relics arrest the attention of the new settlers and become objects of research for the curious. Numerous implements were found and other articles evincing great skill in the arts. Mr. Spaulding, being an educated man and passionately fond of history, took a lively interest in these developments of antiquity. In order to beguile the hours of retirement and furnish employment for his lively imagination, he conceived the idea of giving a historical sketch of this long lost race. Their extreme antiquity, of course, would lead him to write in the most ancient style, and as the Old Testament is the most ancient book in the world, he imitated its style as nearly as possible. His sole object in writing this historical romance was to amuse himself and his neighbors. This was about the year 1812. Hull's surrender at Detroit occurred near the same time, and I recollect the date well from that circumstance. As he progressed in his narrative, the neighbors would come in from time to time to hear portions read, and a great interest in the work was excited among them. It is claimed to have been written by one of the lost nation, and to have been recovered from the earth, and assumed the title of manuscript found. The neighbors would often inquire how Mr. Spaulding progressed in deciphering the manuscript, and when he had sufficient portion prepared, he would inform them, and they would assemble to hear it read. He was enabled from his acquaintance with the classics and ancient history to introduce many singular names which were particularly noticed by people and could be easily recognized by them. Mr. Solomon Spaulding had a brother, Mr. John Spaulding, residing in the place at the time, who was perfectly familiar with this work and repeatedly heard the whole of it read. From New Salem, we were moved to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Here, Mr. Spaulding found an acquaintance and friend in the person of Mr. Patterson, an editor of a newspaper. He exhibited his manuscript to Mr. Patterson, who was very much pleased with it and borrowed it for perusal. He retained it a long time and informed Mr. Spaulding that if he would make out a title page and preface, he would publish it, and it might be a source of profit. This Mr. Spaulding refused to do for reasons which I cannot now state. Sidney Rigdon, who has figured so largely in the history of the Mormons, was at this time connected with the printing office of Mr. Patterson, as is well known in that region. As Rigdon himself has frequently stated, here he had had ample opportunity to become acquainted with Mr. Spaulding's manuscript and to copy it if he chose. It was a matter of notoriety and interest to all who were connected with the printing establishment. At length, the manuscript was returned to its author, and soon after we removed to Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania, where Mr. Spaulding deceased in 1816. The manuscript then fell into my hand and was carefully preserved. It has frequently been examined by my daughter, Mrs. McKinstry of Monson, Massachusetts, with whom I now reside, and by other friends. After the Book of Mormon came out, a copy of it was taken to New Salem, the place of Mr. Spaulding's former residence, and the very place where the manuscript found was written. A woman, actually, it was a misprint, a Mormon preacher appointed a meeting there, and the meeting read and repeated copious extracts from the Book of Mormon. The historical part was immediately recognized by all the older inhabitants of the identical work of Mr. Spaulding, in which they had been so deeply interested. Years before, Mr. John Spaulding was present, who is an eminently pious man, and recognized perfectly the work of his brother. He was amazed and afflicted that it should have been perverted to so wicked a purpose. His grief found vent in a flood of tears, and he rose on the spot, expressed to the meeting his deep sorrow and regret that the writings of his sainted brother should be used for a purpose so vile and shocking. The excitement in New Salem became so great that the inhabitants had a meeting and deputed Dr. Hulbert, one of their number, to repair to this place, and to obtain from me the original manuscript of Mr. Spaulding, for the purpose of comparing it with the Mormon Bible, to satisfy their own minds, and to prevent their friends from embracing an error so delusive. This was in the year 1833. Dr. Hulbert brought with him an introduction and request for the manuscript, signed by Henry Lake, Aaron Wright, and others, with all with whom I was acquainted, as they were my neighbors when I resided in New Salem. I am sure that nothing would grieve my husband more were he living than the use which has been made of his work. The air of antiquity which was thrown about the composition doubtless suggested the idea of converting it to the purpose of delusion. Thus, an historical romance with the addition of a few pious expressions and extracts from the sacred scriptures has been construed into a new Bible and palmed off upon a company of poor deluded fanatics as divine. I have given the previous brief narration that this work of deep deception and wickedness may be searched to the foundation, and its author exposed to the contempt and execration he so justly deserves. So, we're looking at our timeline. We have all these witness statements taken down by Hobart. We see other witnesses gathered later. So 6 years later, Spalding's widow. In 1869, Joseph Miller, who lived in Amity, Pennsylvania. Now, listen to what Joseph Miller says. When Mr. Spalding lived in Amity, Pennsylvania, I was well acquainted with him. I was frequently at his house. He kept what was called a tavern. It was understood that he had been a preacher, but his health failed him and he ceased to preach. I never knew him to preach after he came to Amity. He had in his possession some papers which he had said he had written. He used to read select portions of these papers to amuse us of evenings. These papers were detached sheets of foolscap. He said he wrote the papers as a novel. He called it the manuscript found or the lost manuscript found. He said he wrote it to pass away the time when he was unwell, and after it was written, he thought he would publish it as a novel as a means to support his family. Sometime since a copy of the Book of Mormon came into my hands, my son read it for me, as I have a nervous shaking of the head that prevents me from reading. I noticed several passages which I recollect having heard Mr. Spalding read from his manuscript. One passage on page 148, the copy I have is published. I remember distinctly. He speaks of a battle and says the Amalekites had marked themselves with red on their foreheads to distinguish them from the Nephites. The thought of being marked on the forehead with red was so strange, it fixed itself in my memory. This, together with other passages I remember to have heard Mr. Spalding read from his manuscript. Those who knew Mr. Spalding will soon all be gone, and I am among the rest. I write that what I know may become a matter of history, and that it may prevent people from being led into Mormonism, that most seductive delusion of the devil. From what I know of Mr. Spalding's manuscript and the Book of Mormon, I firmly believe that Joseph Smith, by some means, got possession of Mr. Spalding's manuscript and possibly made some changes in it and called it the Book of Mormon. Then we have Reddick McKee, who also was had read the copied article that contained the statement of Miller and the willing intelligence of the eighth and submitted his statement. So here's what Reddick McKee says. In the fall of 1814, I arrived in the village of Goodwill, or Amity, and for 18 or 20 months sold goods in the store previously occupied by Mr. Thomas Bryce. It was on the main street, a few roads west of Spalding's Tavern, where I was a boarder. With both Mr. Solomon Spalding and his wife I was quite intimately acquainted. He was regarded as an amiable, inoffensive, intelligent old gentleman of some 60 winters, and as having been formerly a teacher or professor in some Eastern academy or college, but I was not aware of his having been a preacher or called reverend. He was afflicted with a rupture which made locomotion painful, confined him much to his house. They possessed but little of this world's goods, and as I understood, selected Amity as a residence because it was a healthy and inexpensive place to live in. I recollect quite well with Mr. Spaulding spending much time in writing on sheets of paper torn out of an old book what purported to be a veritable history of the nations or tribes who inhabited Canaan when or before that country was invaded by the Israelites under Joshua. He described with great particularity their numbers, customs, modes of life, their wars, stratagems, victories and defeats. His style was flowing and grammatical, though gaunt and abrupt, very like the story of the Maccabees and other apocryphal books. In the old Bibles, he called it lost history found, lost manuscript, or some other such name, not disguising that it was wholly a work of the imagination written to amuse himself, and without any immediate view to publication. I read or heard him read many wonderful and amusing passages from different parts of his professed historical records and was struck with the minuteness of his details and the apparent truthfulness and sincerity of the author. Defoe's veritable Robinson Crusoe was not more reliable. I have an indistinct recollection of the passage referred to by Mr. Miller about the Amalekites making a cross with red paint on their foreheads to distinguish them from their enemies in the confusion of battle. But the manuscript was full of equally ludicrous descriptions. After my removal to Wheeling in 1818, I understood from Dr. Cephas Dodd, perhaps, that Mr. Spaulding had died and his widow had returned to her friends in northern Ohio or western New York. She would naturally take the manuscript with her. Now, as in northern Ohio, probably in Lake or Ashtabula County, that the first Mormon prophet or impostor Joe Smith lived and published what he called the Book of Mormon or the Mormon's Bible. It's quite probable, therefore, that with some alterations, the Book of Mormon was in fact the lost book or lost history found of my old landlord Solomon Spaulding of Amity, Washington County, Pennsylvania. I have also a recollection of reading in some newspaper about the time of my removal to California in 1850 an article on this subject charging Joe Smith directly with purloining or in some improper way getting possession of a certain manuscript which an aged clergyman had written for his own amusement as a novel, and out of it making up his pretended Mormon Bible. Smith's converts or followers were challenged to deny the statement. Both the date and the name of the paper I have forgotten. Possibly in your own file, the reporter, some notice of the matter may be found to verify my recollection. Many changes have occurred in Old Catfish's camp as well as in Amity since I first knew them. Mr. Joseph Miller is, I presume, my old friend, Joe Miller, with whom in 1815 I had many a game of house ball at the east side of Spaulding's Tavern. And if so, and this article meets his eye, he will recollect the stripling who sewed tape and other necessaries in the frame house nearly opposite good Tibba Cook's residence in Amity. He was in the prime of life, always in good humor, told the story well, a good shot with a rifle, and the best ball player in the crowd. When he and I happened to be partners, we were sure to win. I wish him many happy days in a green old age. If any of these desultory recollections of the olden time can aid in any way the truth of history and the suppression of a miserable imposture, use them as you deem proper, either in print or in the wastebasket. Respectfully, Reddick McKee. Well, we have more eyewitness testimony to be given, but you'll have to join me next time on an upcoming video. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening.